Assalamu alaikum. You're watching Pakistan Television World, and I'm Faisal Rahman with the special transmission on this extraordinary moot of the OIC that is being held in Islamabad. Earlier, the Foreign Minister, Shah Mahmood Qureshi Saab, was addressing the media, and he was in fact telling them about the overall situation so far, how many delegates have arrived, and according to him, it's a huge number. He says that 437 delegates have registered so far, so that's a very, very encouraging number. And he also mentioned about the 39 congressmen. They have written a letter to Mr. Blinken, the Secretary of State of the United States of America, and the main purpose, the main idea of holding this moot is to make sure that how to avoid the humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan. As we all know, that the 38 million people, out of which almost 60% are at a verge of complete problems such as the issue of food security, medical security, and so on and so forth. Currently, as we all know, that the weather has changed, the harsh winter has arrived, people are in a lot of problem at the moment. Just to make sure that 1.1 million children who are at the verge of starvation should not die because of that. 3.2 million again, I'm talking about the children who are undernourished at the moment out there in Afghanistan. So these are the numbers which are very, very significant. And this particular conference, as I earlier mentioned, was planned and then now is being held just to make sure that these issues should be taken care of. The money that is with the Americans and the other international agencies as well as the European countries should be unfrozen as soon as possible. Now we are talking about the infrastructure, how to make sure that the people should be taken care of. Now whatever Pakistan can do in its given capacity is what is being done. Now before I introduce you to our panelists, our production team has prepared a documentary. Let's watch it.
The deepening humanitarian crisis of Afghanistan represents the most perilous hour for entire humanity as a million Afghan children are starving to death. The economic freefall of war-ravaged country depicts textbook example of aftermath of what happens after the forever war ends. Afghanistan's current humanitarian predicament is unprecedented as an estimated 22.8 million people, more than half the country's population, are expected to face potentially life-threatening food insecurity this winter, according to United Nations World Food Programme. The crumbling healthcare system, economic meltdown of aid-dependent economy, pandemic, food insecurity exacerbated by drought and harsh winter all combine to create a perfect storm for killing more Afghans than bullets.
نمی روزی که بیامد بودن نمی مریض یک روپیه پول نداشت که به خود خو بگیره ما فقط همین شفاخانه است حتی دکتر صاحبای ما بگرفتن همین مثلا دوا کمک کردن میگرفتن به ای بدادن که تی رسیده.
We don't have anything now, no medicines. We're suffering, just sometimes crying.
UN agencies have also been persistently raising alarm about countdown to catastrophe in Afghanistan by underscoring that more than half the country is facing acute food shortages. The executive director of the World Food Programme, David Beasley, noted that we're now looking at the worst humanitarian crisis on earth as 23 million people are marching towards starvation and the next 6 months are going to be catastrophic. It is going to be hell on earth.
We're now looking at the worst humanitarian crisis on earth. 95% of the people don't have enough food, and now we're looking at 23 million people marching towards starvation. Out of that, almost 9 million are knocking on famine's door. The winter months are coming. We're coming out of a drought. The next 6 months are going to be catastrophic.
UN Special Representative to Afghanistan, Deborah Lyons, raised further alarm by stating that Afghanistan is on the brink of a humanitarian catastrophe, while urging the international community to find ways to provide financial support to the Afghan people. Foreign aid, which previously made up about 3/4 of the government budget, has entirely evaporated. Thousands of poor families have already sold their flocks and fled, seeking shelter and assistance in packed temporary camps near major cities. Indicating clear signs of economic crash, Afghan currency has plummeted, food prices are skyrocketing, medicines are out of stock, while across the country, millions of Afghans, from day laborers to doctors and teachers, have gone months without salary.
There's no work. It's a very bad situation. Everything is bad.
Compounding the misery of Afghans, the country is confronting one of the worst droughts in decades, which has withered fields, starved farm animals, and dried irrigation channels. The silver lining is that humanitarian catastrophe is preventable, as its main cause is financial sanctions on the Taliban, which have paralyzed the banking system, affecting every aspect of the economy. As the country's hitherto intervening powers are unwilling to budge from their entrenched positions, Islamabad is relentlessly highlighting the importance of maintaining sustained engagement with Afghanistan to promote stability and jointly counter emerging challenges. Pakistan is also hosting OIC-led Global Mood on Afghanistan, the largest international gathering on Afghanistan since the fall of Kabul to Taliban, with a focus on highlighting the need for urgent assistance and mobilization of resources to avert humanitarian crisis and economic collapse in Afghanistan.
The UN has warned that 60% of Afghanistan's 38 million people are facing hunger or starvation. There is a dire humanitarian crisis looming, which has consequences not only for the people of Afghanistan, but indeed us as neighbors, the region and beyond. With this in mind, on the 19th of December, Pakistan will host an extraordinary session of the Organization of the Islamic Cooperation to mobilize support for providing adequate food, medicine and housing to millions of Afghans in dire distress. Indeed, I believe Pakistan hosting the OIC extraordinary meeting of foreign ministers on Afghanistan is in line with the leadership role the country has demonstrated in the region. From facilitating peace talks to showing tremendous leadership across unprecedented rescue and evacuations, to working closely with international partners for humanitarian outreach and bringing together neighboring countries of Afghanistan and international stakeholders for a coordinated approach.
Premier Imran Khan has periodically reminded the international community about its moral obligation towards the Afghan people, while reiterating Pakistan's enduring commitment towards the Afghans. During his address at the 76th UN General Assembly's annual high-level debate, Premier Imran Khan warned international community against the looming humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan, with serious repercussions for the region and the world. Prime Minister Khan stressed that this is a critical time for Afghanistan. Humanitarian assistance has to be given there immediately, while urging global leaders to mobilize the international community in this direction.
If we neglect Afghanistan right now, according to the UN, half the people of Afghanistan are already vulnerable. And by next year, almost 90% of people in Afghanistan will go below the poverty line. There's a huge humanitarian crisis looming ahead. And this will have serious repercussions, not just for the neighbors of Afghanistan, but it will have repercussions everywhere if a destabilized, a chaotic Afghanistan again becomes a safe haven for international terrorists.
Ironically, as war-ravaged Afghanistan hurtles towards humanitarian and economic collapse, international community persists on viewing the situation from political and diplomatic prism instead of viewing from a humanitarian angle. Mary Ellen McGrorty, the World Food Programme's country director for Afghanistan, urged to separate the politics from the humanitarian imperative, while noting that the millions of women, children and men in the current crisis in Afghanistan are innocent people who are being condemned to a winter of absolute desperation and potentially death. Afghans right now feel abandoned, forgotten and indeed punished by circumstances that are not their fault. Abandoning them would be a historic mistake.
Now to talk about it, let me quickly introduce you to our panelists. We have with us in our studio on my right is Professor Dr. Riffat Hussain Saab. He's a senior strategic analyst. Professor, pleasure to have you on the show, sir. Thank you so much for your time. And we also have with us on Skype Harley Schlanger. He's a political analyst joining us from Germany. Thank you so much for your time, Mr. Harley. And we'll also be talking to Lieutenant General retired Amajd Shoaib Saab, who's a senior analyst. And we'll be also taking his point of view on this very important summit, or the moot as you may call it, that is being held in Islamabad. As earlier the foreign minister also mentioned that this extraordinary OIC meeting in fact is going to pave way for the future of Afghanistan. Earlier you heard whatever was mentioned in the documentary regarding the current crisis. If the aid is not given on time, it is going to create havoc in Afghanistan. And by the next year, which is 2022, and remember this is December we are talking about, half of December has already passed. 90% of the overall population of Afghanistan, they will be, and I'm talking about 35 million people will be below the poverty line. And that is an absolute disaster. So we can't neglect Afghanistan. Now, Professor, let me start off from you. Obviously, we do understand that humanitarian crisis versus geopolitics. Now, don't you think the Western world is actually trying to play on the grounds of the geopolitics rather than on the humanitarian crisis? Because when Joe Biden took charge, we all thought that this man always talks about humanitarian issues. He talks about help. He talks about stability globally, in fact, and food security and so many other important areas. But nothing has been said, nothing has been done so far. Your take, sir.
Well, first, thank you so much for allowing me to participate in this program. We are faced, when I say we, means South Asia, Pakistan, Afghanistan's neighbors, and the world at large are faced with a moment of reckoning, because the situation that Afghanistan finds itself in, the humanitarian disaster that our Prime Minister, our Foreign Minister, and many people have commented on this, is a moment of reckoning, in the sense that the current Afghanistan situation would not have come to this pass were it not for the fact that Afghanistan was subjected to all kinds of atrocities, including bombing and you name it, every possible crime has been committed against the people of Afghanistan. So we are dealing with an unfolding humanitarian crisis with a catastrophic dimensions, not only for Pakistan but also for the region and for the world at large. So how the question that we face today is that how do we deal with this crisis? And the extraordinary meeting of the Council of Foreign Ministers of OIC has been called to figure out a way of humanitarian response. And I do not want to talk about geopolitics, because we know that the regime in Afghanistan, which has been in power for the last few months, particularly since August 15, may not be relevant to the ability of the international community to deal with this crisis. So let's keep the geopolitics out of it and purely deal with this issue in humanitarian terms and come up with a response which is not only timely, but it's also an effective response. And we have now people, US congressmen calling on the American to rethink their approach, and we have the NATO commanders and former ambassadors writing a letter in their own name to the US government to rethink its policy and relax the sanctions that have been imposed on Afghanistan, even though the rationale for sanctions can be supported, but there is absolutely no reason why should the Afghan people, faced with a harsh winter, faced with doctors and millions of people who are out of job and they do not have and they cannot, the banking system has collapsed, and the Afghan people who had little bit of money left in the banks cannot draw upon that money. So how do you survive in a situation which is marked by famine and which is marked by this kind of a collapse that we are witnessing? And because of this, I think Pakistan should be complimented for its efforts to draw world's attention and bring into sharp relief the kind of challenge, the magnitude of the challenge that people in Afghanistan face, because there are two realities if the world fails to pay attention to it. One is the migration of the people, and those are economic migrants, as Foreign Minister Qureshi has said, and the other is that they will add to the because Afghanistan is a landlocked country. So where these refugees are going to go? These refugees are going to flee the country, and their exodus from Afghanistan in massive number would lead to a knock-on effect, not only in the immediate region but also beyond it.
I mean, that is a very, very alarming situation, Dr. Saab.
Yes.
And let's see what our friend in Germany thinks about that. Mr. Harley, now one important point, and that is about the parameters to judge the success of this particular moot. Now, the Foreign Minister of Pakistan has very categorically mentioned that 437 participants they have registered so far. These delegates are here in Pakistan. The OIC head is in Pakistan, the Secretary General, and a lot of foreign ministers will be holding meetings with our foreign minister today, and he mentioned around 12 to 13 so far they have been planned. Now, aims and objectives are very clear, but the parameters to judge and to see about the level of success. Your take on that point, sir?
Well, let me begin by commending Pakistan for its role in addressing this crisis and the OIC for its efforts. Let me also say, as an American who lives in Germany, I'm quite angry at the role of my government and the European nations sitting on the funds, freezing the funds that literally belong to the Afghan people, over $9 billion, which could be enormously important right now as an aid program. Now, there are 2 points or 3 points that actually should be addressed. First, the unfreezing of those funds is an urgent necessity, and my organization, the Schiller Institute, is mobilizing in the United States and in Europe for a commitment to unfreeze those funds as a beginning step toward providing humanitarian aid. Emergency food aid is necessary. The United States spent trillions of dollars to destroy Afghanistan in the war. And now the fact that there's no money available to use the planes to ship food and emergency medical supplies is a disgrace. So we have to unfreeze the funds and provide humanitarian aid. But then there's the next imperative, which is economic development, because getting through the winter is one thing, and words can hardly describe the obvious devastation and the crisis of millions of people starving. But the longer term solution is there needs to be infrastructure, healthcare system, transportation, clean water and electricity. These are urgently needed beyond the immediate period. So I think we have to focus both on a humanitarian aid and the longer term prospects. And toward that end, the Schiller Institute has launched something called Operation Ibn Sina, which is a commitment to make a development of a modern healthcare system in Afghanistan a priority, as this would affect other areas of infrastructure as well.
Now, another important area, Mr. Harley, is about not only the aid, but the timely aid. As they say, that justice delayed is justice denied. So, sir, if there is a delayed aid, don't you think that is also useless after some time? Because we want it to be done now, and now means, sir, on war footing primarily. Because if you look at the current situation, I was just going through a couple of articles, around 20,000 Hazara people are living in tents outside Kabul, not Afghanistan, just only one city, the capital. And so is the case with so many other people, sir. 1.1 million children can die if they are not given food. 3.2 million children would die if they are not taken care of, because starvation, this is what the problem is all about, sir. And when you look at the countries primarily surrounding Afghanistan, perhaps Pakistan, we have our own economic issues. You talk about Iran, they are under sanctions. And when you talk about the countries in north, whether you talk about Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan for that matter, they are not in a position to help Afghanistan the way the West can. But unfortunately, sir, because of the influence of the Americans and the West, they are the trendsetters and they are the narrative setters also. If they do not agree, nothing can happen. Do you think this is a correct statement, sir?
Well, let's not spare words. The sanctions, in my view, are a war crime. The idea that you're going to punish the people of Afghanistan because you don't agree with the Taliban's political and religious outlook is a crime. And that's something that we can address in the longer term. But in the short term, we have to mobilize the conscience of the people in the United States and Europe. You know, the Afghan situation is no longer in the media in the West. It's forgotten. The war is over and the people are being denied the humanitarian instinct, which actually I think is there in many Americans and many Europeans. And instead, the governments are, as your documentary emphasized, are treating the situation as a geopolitical concern rather than humanitarian concern. And that just exemplifies the horrific attitude that exists in the West with the idea that now that the war is over, the Western military can orient toward confronting Russia and China as opposed to cooperation. And I'm hoping that what will come out of this OIC meeting is a move to expand the U.S. role in the extended troika. Because look, the United States, as I said, spent trillions of dollars on the war. We can spend billions of dollars in providing aid, immediately shipping large quantities of food, mobilizing the U.S. logistical capabilities with bombers instead of carrying bombs and weapons, bring food to Afghanistan. And that's what has to happen, food and medical supplies. That's what has to happen immediately. The idea of a humanitarian catastrophe occurring in front of the world is an atrocity and has to be addressed.
All right. Now, General Amjad Shoaib Sahab, Assalamu Alaikum ji, and thank you very much, sir, for joining PDV World's transmission on this very important, extraordinary meeting on Afghanistan. General Sahab, I'm sure you must have been watching the television, you must be reading a lot about it. Now, your take, sir, on this particular moot, that is Pakistan's initiative, sir. A lot of people believe that, I think, this can provide a lot of relief to the Afghan people. But at the same time, there is another school of thought that unless and until the Americans agree, nothing is going to be materialized. Your take, Jan Saab.
See, before this takeover by the Taliban, the Western world was funding and many people, they were receiving pay, there was a system which was in place. And suddenly when the Taliban came in, people lost their jobs. First of all, if we think of the armed forces and also the law enforcement agencies, etc., the intelligence, they are out of job. They don't have any buying power, and at the same time, the other communities or the other people like Hazaras and many other cross-sections of the society who are living in very far-flung areas, they are without food and without clothing, etc., because the winters are there. And unfortunately, nobody has carried out a detailed assessment of the disaster which we are expecting to be faced by these people. And there is no system worked out where perhaps the distribution can also be made. There is no hope for these people because suddenly the country which was receiving a lot of funding because of the war, it's not there. Now the countries who have been there for 20 years, they spent a lot of money, but it was all not for the betterment of the people, but for perhaps for funding the war. They have a moral responsibility now to come forward and come up, and then whatever devastation they have, they had brought on to these people, now that has to be, they are to be helped so that at least they can live through this very severe winter, and also whatever devastation they had faced, something can be at least given to them in the way of help. Now there is no system there at the moment, and I personally have a feeling that we are already very late. This conference that we are holding, perhaps people will promise, they will say that, look, we are going to provide testing or we are going to provide so many funds. Ultimately, the United Nations has to step in, and they have to take over, they have to place the system, and things have to be distributed to the people. Unfortunately, we are very late now. So the crisis and the human disaster or human problem that we were seeing, that there is going to be human crisis. Pakistan has been talking about it for too long, but I think the response was not there. So ultimately, this disaster is now setting in. This is very, very serious, and I think people have to rush in and they have to take stock of these things. These conferences, etc., they must realize the crisis situation which
tangible steps should be taken, General Saab. That's what you say. I mean, conferences are good enough, but
the urgency has to be realized. Now, we were talking about the release of funds by United States. See, it is such a painful thing to think about it, that on one hand, the United States is talking about the human rights of the people, and they say that the Taliban, perhaps they are not looking after the human rights and the rights of the women. But if you do not provide them the funds, isn't it the violation of the human rights of the people when they'll be dying out due to hunger? You are holding on to their funds, you are not giving them. That, I think, is a criminal act which perhaps is being now taken by the Americans.
Exactly, General Saab. When you talk about human rights or women rights for that
human
matter.
Rights, yes, that doesn't matter. If the
exactly.
people die of
if
hunger.
People are dying, what is the point of the women rights and all? Yes?
Hunger, see, they can live with perhaps a little bit of lesser rights which Western world perhaps thinks about from the
all right,
folk. But they will die because of hunger, and they will remember that these were the people, the Western world, which perhaps were sitting on their funds, and ultimately this country went into this chaos.
And sir, nobody knows about the ongoing misery in Afghanistan, as I have been interviewing a lot of people who were in Europe, and they had mentioned that no help, forget about that. There is not even a single news story on television or even in the papers about this current crisis. But General Saab, thank you so much for your comments. Last quick comment from you, sir, before we take the break, and that is about the role of the GCC countries, sir, in particular. I was listening to Mohammed bin Salman the other day, and he was talking about that this is how Middle East would look like. This is going to be like Europe. This is exactly what he mentioned, not taking the name of Iran or Syria for that matter, but it did invite Iraq for that reason. Now, sir, the role of GCC, these are rich countries, oil-rich countries. Look at the kind of economy they have, and they have the capacity, literally, to help Afghanistan without even the wish and will of the Americans. Will it happen, sir, or do you think under the pressure of the Americans, they'll stay quiet the way they are?
Well, when you are dealing with a humanitarian tragedy and a looming humanitarian catastrophe affecting the lives directly of the 30 million Afghans, you can't pigeonhole Afghanistan, geopolitics as well as separate it from the crying need for help. So I think that this is a great moment of crisis, and the Islamic countries, because Afghanistan has been the founding member of the OIC countries when the organization came into existence in 1969. So Afghanistan has supported the OIC all along, and now it's a great responsibility of the Islamic countries, not only of Afghanistan's neighbors, but I think the larger Ummah or the larger Islamic community to come forward in this greatest need.
Doctor, we'll have to take a break here, and I would like you to quickly answer me in yes or no. Do you still believe in the concept of Muslim Ummah, the Muslim Brotherhood?
Well, I still believe in it, because in situations like these, when you are dealing with a humanitarian crisis affecting millions of the lives of the one of the founding members of the OIC community, then geopolitics have to transcend, and you have to pool your resources to deal with that crisis. And whether that happens or not we'll find out in about when the moot ends on December 20th.
All right, we'll just take a short break here. After the break, we'll continue our transmission. Stay with us.